Hi everyone, it's Ren here, and in this I suppose it's my second video on INFJ and philosophy, but it's the first video that I'm going to dedicate to an actual philosopher. I was originally tempted to do it on Spinoza, as I said in my previous video, but in the end I've chosen to start with this beginning, not of philosophy, but of the influential INFJ philosophy of Plato. So Plato, very traditionally associated with INFJ, the INFJ type. There are already videos and articles on why Plato is INFJ. So because of that, I don't necessarily want to just make yet another video on why Plato is INFJ. I think that we can take it for granted that he was, But I'm going to sort of try to make a video on Plato's INFJness that is a bit different. And I would like to sort of look at different ways in which the INFJness of Plato is manifested in his philosophy, and also how, in a very interesting way, it needs the ENTP character of Socrates in his dialogues for the vast majority of them. Not really all of them, actually. Toward the end, Socrates becomes less influential as a character. He becomes more of a mouthpiece for Plato. But it's very, very interesting to see how the INFJ Plato makes use of the ENTP Socrates in his work to further his ideas. Because at first sight, you might say, well, the ENTP and the INFJ, okay, they're supposed to be compatible types to get on in friendship and in relationships, but is it clear that they should sort of ally with one another in a philosophy? Given that by definition an ENTP would be an extroverted intuitive, so perceived possibility and alternatives, constant alternatives, and tend to have difficulty in settling for a unified vision because they will be constantly checking it against other possibilities, whereas an INFJ will tend to have the opposite issue, which is to be too focused on their single vision, because that's how they give meaning to the movement that they make towards achieving that vision. It's very hard for them to conceive of possible alternatives. They'll conceive of possible alternatives to how to realize that vision, but to question the vision itself, very hard for an INFJ, if not impossible. It's the strength, an immense strength, because it helps you keep focus, but it can also be a weakness, because it can make it hard for you to be willing to, not necessarily to admit you're wrong, but to question the very way in which you think about a topic. So in any case, I think that that can be said of pretty much all the philosophers that have been INFJ. But to remain focused on Plato, well, how is Plato's INFJness is manifested, first of all, and then we'll talk about Socrates a little bit in a second. Well, it's quite clear that Plato has a vision, and you could express Plato's vision in many, many different ways, and of course that vision has a lot of different dimensions. But, this is going to be a short video, so I'm going to have to try to make it quite synthetic. Let's say that Plato's vision, and he's well known for that, is his vision of the forms, okay? You've heard of a Platonic form. These ideal essences of things. For example, I have a glass in my hand here. What Plato says is that for the very ability that we have to conceptualize of this individual glass, there must be the ideal form of the glassness somewhere in the universe, in a sphere that is not accessible to us. That is an ideal sphere where there is no duration, when there is no disintegration, there is no becoming. It's a sphere of being and not of becoming. And that, in a sense, an individual glass is the individuated manifestation in the world of the ideal incarnation of glassness in this realm of the forms. and that the reason why we can have a concept of anything, a concept of a person, a concept of a book, a concept of a glass, or even an abstract concept of, say, any particular virtue, say the virtue of courage, for example. We can call someone courageous, but where does the concept of courage itself originate from? How do we come up with it? It's a very important point that I will make in a second in relation to Socrates. But essentially, this is Plato's vision. And maybe some of you will think, oh, that's not so original. We see similar things in Christianity with the kingdom of God, being the kind of spiritual ideal in contrast with the terrestrial kingdom. We see that in the noumena of Kant, the object or the thing in itself that we cannot access, which is the sort of permanent incarnation of what we see as a finite phenomena or phenomenon. We see that in many other philosophies, Western philosophies. And I'm gonna tell you, yeah, you're right. But what does that suggest? Well, it suggests, that our INFJ friend Plato was extremely influential on Christianity, on Kant, and on everyone who followed. I mean, the fact that we see this idea, this vision being replayed later, or even until now, until basically today, like a lot of people still think in terms of forms, really, like they don't realize it, but often when we think in terms of the ideal essences of things, we are really reasoning in a Platonic sense. Well, that just says that INFJ Plato was the jazz, he was the jam. So and the vision was really that, it was a vision that Plato had. Nobody else really had it. He was the first to synthesize it, and that's really the manifestation of Plato's NI, because he didn't arrive at this vision. He didn't arrive at this conclusion about the forms by dint of scientific experimentation or by testing certain arguments logically. No, he just had the vision, and then he spent a lot of his career, a lot of his life articulating that vision through his 30 plus dialogues, right? And that's how Plato's NI is manifested. The FE of Plato is manifested in the fact that he clearly, and you see that in the Republic, of course, but in the most obvious sense, but in a sense, all of his dialogues are really meant to educate in a way. They're meant for people to read and to think and to get the sense of what the forms are and how understanding what that means also could guide our life. And that is mostly manifested in the most vivid way in the Republic, because that's kind of like, in a way, you could say that it's Plato's treatise for government, for how to organize an actual republic based on these principles. And that's an extremely FE thing, when you universalize your NI vision in such a way as to want to make it applicable and for people to be able to embrace it to better people's lives. Now, the TI of Plato is tertiary in the sense that he can have a well-articulated argument and development and unpacking of his NI vision, but it is always serving the NI vision. It's not dominating the NI vision, because Plato sticks to the forms from start to finish. He doesn't really update it that much, but he lays it out. He lays it out with his TI, and he develops how that can be, well, even his theory of the forms is divided into subcategories. It's not a manifestation of extroverted thinking. It is really the manifestation of how Plato sort of categorizes the different dimensions of his vision and how it can be applied then via FE to society. Now, Socrates, how is Socrates and his ENTPness relevant to Plato's enterprise? Well, obviously Plato was never thinking Socrates is the ENTP, therefore he's going to be useful to me. But this is my theory, this is my hypothesis, by the way, and this is why I thought it might be useful to share here, as opposed to just a generic video on Plato being INFJ. Well, what does the theory of forms imply? Well, the theory of forms imply that there are ideals and that we can get close to those ideals, but because they are ideals and because they are because they are not accessible in their pure form, by definition, since they are in a realm that is not accessible to us, since we are ourselves in the realm of life, we are in the realm of perishing, of becoming. We have a start and an end. Some things in the world have very, very long lives, but they end up disappearing or dying, physically disintegrating. That's not what the domain of the ideal forms is like. It is a domain of being, and therefore we cannot access it. It will be contradictory for becoming and being to be unified. It's not possible. Therefore, Plato's vision allows us to contemplate the forms and be influenced by the attempt to get as close as possible to what the forms are in their ideal, but we can never quite get there. We can only get as close as possible. Isn't that exactly what the dialogues try to do? When when you have, say, like the symposium on what love is, when you have the various dialogues that are dedicated to the virtues, what is courage, what is piety, when you have the discussions about what is the ideal domain, like the precursor to what will become the kingdom of God, this ideal world, when Plato discusses what is knowledge, all these different things, right? But maybe even more so the different virtues, when he discusses happiness, when he discusses all these different things. Well, basically, the whole point of the dialogue is going to be, we're going to try to get as close as possible to the ideal form, and that will be in itself an educating experience. But at the same time, we will never get to the form itself, and when we try to get to the form itself, we land in contradictions because it's impossible. So the best thing that we can do is to have a dialogue or a conversation with other people, together try to get as close as possible for the sake of our own lives, for the sake of the practice of our own life, to the best possible understanding of a particular thing, while remaining aware that what we can only ever do is get as close as possible to it. And when we try to pretend, or when we pretend that we've understood it completely, that is a complacency, because that's not possible, and that could end up being, if you like, that could end up sort of being contradictory to our purposes, right? That could end up backfiring in a sense. And that's what Socrates is there for. He's the NTP who's going to say, let's explore together, we brainstorm, we discuss the different virtues, and we try to really get to the core of what they're about. Courage, or anything else, wisdom. Let's discuss the nature of knowledge. Let's discuss the nature of this. And then, like his interlocutors, as displayed by Plato, will be coming forward and say, oh yeah, so courage is this, or love is that. And Socrates, the NTP, will say, well, how about, he'll use TI to say, well, aren't you wrong about how you articulate this? And he'll use his any to say, look, maybe we could look at that other option. And then they continue discussing and they make some progress. But Socrates, being the NTP that he is constantly seeing potential contradictions and other possibilities. And in the end, almost every dialogue ends with this idea that they only got so far, but in the end, they just have to admit that they failed to completely manage to identify the core definition of the form. And that's because the form is not possible to define by a human being, because it is inaccessible to the human being. But because Plato has an eye and he has a vision, he can still locate the form. Because if you're a TI Dom, for instance, you would never say, well, there is a form and we cannot access it. Because, I mean, that's kind of what Kant says, and I think that's because he's influenced by the INFJ Plato. Because he'll say, well, if you cannot arrive at it logically or empirically, then why would you pretend that there is a thing anyway? But that's what Plato says. It is there. We know it is. But we cannot get to the essence of it by our own cognitive powers alone. And that's why he needs Socrates, because Socrates is the brainstorm person. He's the person who could say, look at the alternative and don't get too complacent, because we can only ever get there. Now, an INFJ might be very frustrated by Socrates in real life, but that's fine for Plato, because the vision itself of Plato is about that. And so the ENTP Socrates in Plato's work is going to help him to illustrate his vision. Okay? And just a last point, towards the end of his life, Plato, as he was getting closer and closer to the articulation of his vision and more certain about the forms, needed Socrates less and less, because he no longer even needed to have Socrates like challenge other people to not be complacent about thinking they can attain it, because he had essentially made his point, and he could just say, okay, Socrates is there, and what his role is now taken for granted, and so let's just unpack in Plato's late work the essence of what he wanted to say. Okay, and that's what I wanted to illustrate, and why I thought that having an ENTP as sort of your character when you're trying to develop an NI insight can actually be very fruitful and useful to the NI insight. See you guys.